When I was in high school, I was the secretary of my school's new diversity club. I grew up in Ridgefield, Connecticut, so in that very white bread town, there simply was not a lot of racial diversity. Still, in collaboration with a well-respected national organization, the ADL, we put on some good school-wide assemblies and we did our best. Some of us, I should say, did our best. Because when I became secretary, I learned that part of that role entailed taking attendance. For a meeting that typically boasted about half a dozen students every couple of weeks, the attendance spreadsheet had easily 10 times as many names on it. Some of these people haven't been to a meeting in months or years, I remember thinking. It wasn't too long before I put together 2 and 2. Per school rules, a student only needed to attend a minuscule number of meetings of a club over the course of a school year in order to be considered a member. 99.8% of my graduating class went on to college. So in order to have their pick of schools, students would join clubs that looked good on a college application. At least one club, at least one sport, another extracurricular, and good grades. That was the equation for well-roundedness and for success in the eyes of others, or so we were told. The result, though, was that a lot of these clubs had students on their rolls who did not authentically really belong there. Jesus knew a thing or two about trying to be authentic in how he lived and in how he ministered to others. In this passage, he is responding to his critics who were grumbling because Jesus was becoming known as one who would eat with the so-called tax collectors and sinners. To this, Jesus says, well, okay, John came neither eating nor drinking. They say he has a demon. Now the Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and they say, look, he's a glutton. Jesus is describing one of those catch-22 moments, right? I have heard that people of color can relate. Our culture's response to white folks who are angry is very different than our culture's response towards black folks who are angry. I know women can relate too. If a woman speaks quietly and reflectively, she is demure and often ignored. But if she speaks boldly, she's seen as rather witchy, replace the W with a B, and is also ignored. Ageism is here too, right? If we have lived more life years, we might be seen as out of touch rather than wise. But if we haven't lived as long, surely we can't have the life experience that allow people to take us seriously. So whoever we are, I imagine we have had this experience in one way or another. You're darned if you do behave in a certain way, and you're also darned if you don't. And you're also darned if you are a certain way, and darned if you are not. So we are in our final week of a 3-parter sermon series on compassion fatigue. A few weeks ago, we saw that compassion means to suffer with, this passion, suffering, calm with, right? And we realized that it meant to really feel one's guts turn in caring for others, in suffering with another person. We learned a fun little word, splagkasninomai, which is, I just love repeating it. I'll just keep bringing this up every week until I can actually pronounce it in a way that feels easy. But we learned this word knowing that it actually meant Jesus' guts turned inside of him as he viewed the crowds with compassion. We also reflected upon how very exhausting that work can be. 2 weeks ago, we talked again about compassion and how compassion fatigue can actually be a wake-up call, reminding us that we are indeed not God. We are called to be engaged in this work, but to also realize our own limitations. And this week, we have Jesus expanding upon what it is like when we try something in our life and our ministry out of compassion, and it fails. So then we try another approach, and it also fails. Should we come eating or drinking or not? We hear Jesus's echoes of no matter what I do, it's never good enough for you people. That is a good equation for compassion fatigue. So I invite us to sit for a minute with what Jesus was actually talking about in this passage. And I want to start with a question. How often do all of you try to be all things for all people in your life, utilizing all the different approaches that you can think of? If technology isn't your jam, but you need it for a job, you try to learn it. If you're not the most outgoing, but the work requires it of you, you put on that persona. If you think you need to be assertive with your kids when all you want to do is cuddle them, you do that too. The list goes on and on. Every one of those scenarios takes a little bit out of you, and then a little bit more. Donning masks like this can be tiring. And eventually we find ourselves beyond tired when we wear too many masks too often without a space where we can be our authentic selves. We can sometimes forget who we are. Many of you know that I was part of and still am in some ways, part of a multi-year-long leadership program through the National Office of the UCC for young ministers called Next Generation Leadership Initiative, NGLI for short. I started this program back in 2019. And when I started, the powers that be had us fill out a test from the Strengths Finders program. For those of you who haven't heard of Strengths Finders, it's the brainchild of a man named Ton Rath, who was a researcher and practitioner in the fields of human behavior as seen in health, business, and economics. His book is a worldwide bestseller, has been used in countless businesses, many of them Fortune 500 companies, for the edification of their employees. The book is based on a really interesting premise, though, especially for those of us who have been trained to sort of acquire skills or change our style or be someone else to fit a situation we're in. The book, instead, essentially says that everyone is a leader and that there are all different kinds of leaders and styles of leadership, each one uniquely suited for the task at hand. So the CEO of Goldman Sachs, for example, needs different leadership traits than, say, Winston Churchill did in navigating Great Britain through World War II. The accompanying test groups its subjects into general categories and then really, really doubles down on the idea that we are not called to try to be different people than who we are. It doubles down and tells us to triple down even upon our unique strengths. The idea is that it is better for the world for us to be great at one or two things than it is for us to be mediocre or even good at a handful of things. Now, for those of us who are accustomed to trying to be more well-rounded, if we try the one club, one sport, one extra activity, good grades, doing a good job, being a good employee, being a good employer, being a good parent, being a good spouse, tending to the people and friends all around you, having this well-rounded life, for those of us who know what that is like, for those of us well acquainted with working our tails off in areas that are not our strengths, for those of us who know the compassion fatigue that can result from trying to do all of this stuff, the Strengths Finders claim can be either very, very much a healing balm for our tired soul or really challenging. But I have a sense that Jesus was getting at something similar for those of us who know what it is, especially to change from our work identity to our personal identity as quickly as we change into casual clothes after a long business day. Jesus talks about his ministry and John the Baptist as well. Neither one gained ground with the given group of towns they visited in this particular teaching. These two men were very different leaders, very different styles of communicating, of interacting with others. I just was at Synod this past week, and I had lunch with a very dear friend of mine who names his identity as a John the Baptist person. And oh my gosh, to talk through how he is accompanying his church in the season in which they find themselves required translation, right? Like, I was saying things like, but you have to love them, right? And he's like, well, yeah, of course, but that means I tell them, I'm like, okay, this is very interesting. He wouldn't be a good fit in some other churches, nor would I be a good fit in some of the places he has served. Today's culture names that sometimes neither one of those types of approaches is really welcome. Today's culture would say, well, let's try being a little more like this in this moment. We get that kind of feedback all the time, right? To change and adapt our behavior so that it achieves a more desirable end result. This is exactly what annual reviews do. But Jesus does not give any such advice here at all. Jesus essentially lambasts the townspeople, cursing them for listening to neither him nor John. Jesus does not try something else. He tries his best, he realizes it doesn't work, and he moves on. Tom Rath's Strengths Finder would espouse a similar approach. So this is an interesting quandary. What do we do here? Because to some degree, of course, it is good and healthy to learn new things, to try new approaches, to become more holistic in our way of being, to reach more people. For those of us who actually graced the doors of the Diversity Club meetings, we were a pretty welcoming bunch who did our best to give everyone a role. But for those who just dashed off their name on an attendance sheet in order to fill a college application, for those people, it was less helpful and less authentic. In his remarks, Jesus is challenging the approach that tells us to be everything to everybody, thereby stretching ourselves so thin such that our very identities become stretched past what they were supposed to be, like a rubber band or an old shirt that no longer looks quite good on us. The alternate path is to be as Jesus was, unapologetically himself, no matter what the external results. You don't need to do Diversity Club if robotics is your thing. Beloved of God, a question. How do you go about your days? Are you finding yourself stretched to the point where you are not functioning out of your authentic self most of the time? Are you feeling that level of fatigue? Because that is compassion fatigue part 3. That's compassion fatigue for our own being and who God has created us to be. Or are you doubling down on your strengths, your gifts, thus allowing God to flow through you and allowing yourself to live a more authentic life to the fullest? We talk a lot in this church about gaining wisdom as we live out our lives, as we delve more deeply into our faith. Sometimes trying new things allows us to gain that wisdom, no question. But in verse 25 here, Jesus says, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent. You have revealed them to infants. And so I'm not encouraging us to be crying infants, please, but it is undeniable that babies are unabashedly authentic. They live in the present moment. They're hungry, they cry. If they're happy, they probably cry too. But they are in the moment. In this passage, we hear that it is not always possible to reach people by changing our approach, especially if it means acting out of a place that does not feel truly us. I have served churches that are not open and affirming. As a straight, cis, white woman, it's a heck of a lot easier for me to lean into that space than it is for others whose identity is threatened by those spaces. But I found it very difficult to be authentically me, especially from the pulpit. These things are hard. And how much can we lean into them before they start becoming too tiring? So all this talk of masks, shifting identities, doubling down on strengths and gifts and whatnot, all of it begs one more question. And it's the most historic question for humankind at the root of existentialism itself. How do we know who we are? Authentically, deep within our beings. How do we know? And then how do we know how to act from that place, that being? God does not leave us in the darkness of compassion fatigue, not ever. The answer comes at the conclusion of our passage in what is truly, and I really mean this, it's my favorite verse in all the scriptures. I know I've said that before, but this one, like, I really mean it. This is my favorite verse. It truly is my all-time favorite. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you that are weary and heavy laden. and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Folks, we are God's. That is who we are. We are invited to come with all of our weariness, all of our compassion fatigue, with all of our failed attempts trying to hit that bullseye, be everything for everyone. We come to the one who says, you are already everything. You are already enough. This is an easy, light yoke. We are the ones who make it hard and heavy, often, with all of our worries about second guessing, about trying to be the right thing for the right moment. Did I say the right thing back then? What's going to happen tomorrow? Past and future are dangerous in these kinds of machinations that happen in our minds. No, says God, come to me now. Double down on your strengths and your strength as my child. I have made you right for the right moment. I have made you the right one for the right moment. Rest for our souls is found in this knowledge, that even babies know that we are so deeply beloved, and we need not try to be anything beyond that. So, beloved of God, opportunities abound for stretching oneself in terms of tasks, but there is a gentle encouragement here for you to double down on and rest in and gather strength from who you are and whose you are. If you are the introverted leader and less outwardly charismatic than the person to your left, that is okay. In fact, that is wonderful. The world needs you to be you, and so does God. If you are the working parent, less present at the school than the stay-at-home parent, that is okay. The world needs you to be you. And your kids need you to be you too. And so does God. If you are the 99-year-old who struggles with newfangled technology and you would rather stick to writing cards to church members, that is okay. The world needs you to be you. If you're stuck in a profession or a relationship that does not allow you to function from this deep place of where your strengths and your being reside, then perhaps it might be time for a shift. The world needs you to be you. God would hope for nothing less for you and for the world. Only then will the yoke of living be easy, the burden of Christian life be light. Only then will compassion fatigue be transformed again into compassion, no fatigue at all. Only then can we actually lean into the harder stuff, the more burdensome stuff of promoting justice in this world. Because we know that God holds that burden with us and for us. It's like being with the friend who knows you, right? That friend who really gets you, to whom you can say just about anything without fear or judgment. It's so freeing, isn't it? It's so burden-free. It's a light way of being. God wishes that for us all the time. Beloved of God, in this season, may we approach God with all that we are. With all of our strengths, with all of our repeated failures, with all of our fatigue. And may we allow God to give us a yoke that is easier than anything we could actually don for ourselves. It is actually seriously difficult to do this, to cast off the attempt to do all things in favor of doing one or two or three things really, really well. But may God, with rest for our souls, show us the way. It is free of fatigue. And what a gift that is. May that compassion be so for each one of us. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.